Chapter 7 Fanged Noumenon Passion of the Cyclone. The supreme concept with which it is customary to begin a transcendental philosophy is the division into the possible and the impossible. But since all division presupposes a concept to be divided, a still higher one is required, and this is the concept of an object in general, taken problematically, without its having been decided whether it is something or nothing. Kant. What matters is not the enunciation of the wind, but the wind. Peter Hillmore's report for The Observer, 5th of May 1991, begins, "As idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. The water is still now, almost unnaturally so, as if it was resting from its monumental act of carnage, exhausted by its orgasmic tidal surge. Nothing seems to move. The water, so savage last week, now laps gently around the bodies. Half embedded in the mud, and very, very still, a child lies in the water, arms and legs stiffly outstretched, its body bloated by the heat, its face battered and bloody. Next to it lies the body of a calf, its eyes wide in final, uncomprehending shock. A few yards away in the middle of the road lie the bodies of 2 dead fish, as if the sea had even turned on its own." The state of Bangladesh, until 1971 East Pakistan, is nestled in the delta complex of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers, and is amongst the poorest as well as the most densely populated regions of the earth. It is a country whose natural inheritance is a mixture of fertility and disaster, and whose people are exposed by their poverty to the unimpeded course of elemental forces, rendered naked before the storms. Since records began in the 18th century, at least 1.2 million Bangladeshis have been killed by cyclones, as many as 500,000 in the storm of 1970 alone. Cyclones are atmospheric machines that transform latent energy into angular momentum in a feedback process of potentially catastrophic consequence. Their conditions of emergence are a warm water surface, a latitude of at least 5 or 6 degrees deviation from the equator, such that the Coriolis effect is operative, a pronounced instability in the air column, or a low surface pressure, and the absence or virtual absence of wind shear. When these conditions coexist, a cyclone can develop, over a period that normally lasts from 4 to 8 days. A large cyclone transfers 3.5 billion tons of air an hour from the lower to the upper atmosphere, and releases energy in the order of 10 to the 25 ergs every second. At the center of the cyclone is a still zone of low pressure known as the eye or core, which registers no radar echo, and which functions as the immobile motor of the storm's angular momentum or expressed energy. Large cyclones have the impact of immense explosions, and when they strike the coast of Bangladesh, they leave a shockwave in the silt, throwing up numerous evanescent islands in the shallows of the Gulf of Bengal. Due to the general hunger for land, and the richness of the sediment that has been carried down to the sea, these fragile traces are enthusiastically occupied. Rice is cultivated upon them, and fish harvested from their shores. It takes no great feat of imagination to envisage the fate of the peasants and fishermen clustered on these insubstantial ripples of earth when the cyclone returns, and instantaneously consumes the tenuous vestiges of previous ravages. The densely inhabited silt traces are not merely flooded, but utterly erased, as everything which had seemed solid is dissolved into the vortex of the storm. The people of the Bangladesh coast are episodically consumed by a harsh truth from which we can momentarily hide. Being a patriarchal faith, or doctrine of identity, the Islamic culture predominant in Bangladesh is no better a preparation for this liquidation than Judaism or Christianity would be. Nevertheless, an annihilation such as that of the cyclone, in which all stability is washed away and loss alone prevails, is not merely a disaster, but religion. Of the terrain of pure understanding, Kant says, "The domain is an island, enclosed by nature itself within unalterable limits. It is the land of truth, enchanting name, surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean, the native home of illusion. where many a fog bank and many a swiftly melting iceberg give the deceptive appearance of farther shores, deluding the adventurous seafarer ever anew with empty hopes, and engaging him in enterprises which he can never abandon, and yet is unable to carry to completion. Is not transcendental philosophy a fear of the sea, something like a dike or a sea-wall? A longing for the open ocean gnaws at us, as the land is gnawed by the sea. A dark fluidity at the roots of our nature rebels against the security of terra firma, provoking a wave of anxiety in which we are submerged, until we feel ourselves drowning, with representation draining away. Nihil ulterius. Incipit Kant. We are not amphibians, but belong upon solid earth. Let us renounce all strange voyages. The age of desire is past. The new humanity, I anticipate, has no use for enigmatic horizons. It knows the ocean is madness and disease. Let me still your ancient tremors and replace them with dreams of an iron shore. Reason, in its legitimate function, is a defense against the sea, which is also an inhibition of the terrestrial, retarding our tendency to waste painstakingly accumulated resources in futile expeditions, a barrier opposed to the expenditure offerees, as Bataille describes it. It is a fortified boundary, sealing out everything uncertain, irresolvable, dissolvent, a sea wall against the unknown, against death. This is a structure continuous with the great land reclamation projects of Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, a matter of drainage, rigorous separation of the wet and the dry, eradication of marshes and ambiguous terrains, rigidification of the soil, the mosquitoes and other stinging insects that make the wilds of America so trying for the savages may be so many goads to urge these primitive men to drain the marshes and bring light into the dense forests that shut out the air, and, by so doing, as well as by the tillage of the soil, to render their abodes more sanitary. Kant. Such terrestrialism reaches its zenith in Prussia's classic age. In the restriction of policy to continental ambitions, it is thus characterized by a certain hardness, a certain deliberate blindness towards death, as towards everything that flows freely, like a wound. Unlike either Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, who in different ways seek to place themselves outside the ambit of an Occidental history dominated by the monotheistic order of the supreme object, and to connect with the East Asiatic zero that contests it, Bataille seems to resign himself to a struggle without refuge against the one. Far more even than Nietzsche, Bataille thinks of zero as a subtraction from one, as the death of God, and approaches it in anguish. In this way, he aligns himself with a procedure of immense influence upon the course of European modernity, that of a progressive problematization from unity, harmonized with the dissolution of sedentary community. The most powerful example of such thinking is to be found in the cultural heartland of capital, which is to say, in the critical philosophy initiated by Kant. Bataille interrupts inner experience in order to make a few pages of remarks about Hinduism, in a section which ends with a technical argument designed to reinforce his claim to be no more interested in liberation from rebirth than in any other type of salvation. He compares the asceticism of Hinduism to that of Christianity, distancing himself from both in the name of excess, and pretends to no affinity with the naivete and purity of the Hindu. Perhaps most important of all is the affirmation of mess and inadequacy implicit in the words, "I do not doubt that the Hindus go far into the impossible, but to the highest degree they lack that which matters to me, the faculty of expression." It is because he is a writer that Bataille disdains to be a mystic. In what he understands of the Hindu religion, and he lays claim to no intimate knowledge of it, there is one tenet alone to which he unconditionally subscribes. Only intensity matters. Inner experience translates mysticism into a vagrant vocabulary at the scurf edge of tradition. As the initial gesture of a Summa e Theologica, it begins amongst the ruins of God. Echoing Céline, that other wretched tramp of nihilism, he calls experience a voyage to the end of the possible of man, and thinks interiority not as the secret recess of the self, but as a plane of contact and contagion. The core of inner experience is not personal identity, but naked intensity, denuded even of oneself, and jutting from the refuse of Christian dogmatics as a broken lurch into the unknown. He insists inner experience is ecstasy, whilst ecstasy is communication, opposing itself to the subsidence onto oneself. It is the order of the object that organizes inner experience as private reverie, and as a detachment from relation. Above all, it is the God of monotheism, the supreme or absolute being, which reproduces the prison of individuation at the scale of the cosmos. This is why the ecstasy of the unknown, which gnaws away the last landmarks from Bataille's voyage, contests any possible resurrection of theological edifices. As he remarks, I hold the apprehension of God, even when formless and without mode, for an arrest of the movement which carries us to the more obscure apprehension of the unknown. An utter intoxication, such as this, is quite different from its Kantian anticipation, although Kant too contests the right of dogmatic theology to guide his journey. Nothing but the sobriety of a critique, at once strict and just, can free us from this dogmatic delusion, which, through the lure of an imagined felicity, keeps so many in bondage to theories and systems. Such a critique confines all our speculative claims rigidly to the field of possible experience, and it does this not by shallow scoffing at ever-repeated failures or pious sighs over the limits of our reason, but by an effective determining of these limits in accordance with established principles, inscribing nihil ulterius on those pillars of Hercules which nature herself has erected in order that the voyage of our reason may be extended no further than the continuous coastline of experience itself reaches, a coast we cannot leave without venturing upon a shoreless ocean which, after alluring us with ever-deceptive prospects, compels us in the end to abandon as hopeless all this vexatious and tedious endeavor. For Kant, it is not enough to have reached the ocean, the shoreless expanse, the nihil ulterius, as positive zero. He recognizes the ocean as a space of absolute voyage, and thus of hopelessness and waste. Only another shore would redeem it for him, and that is nowhere to be found. Better to remain on dry land than to lose oneself in the desolation of zero. It is for this reason that he says the concept of a noumenon is a merely limiting concept. In this way, the Occidental obsession with the object consummates itself in the blind passivity of its nihilism. Beyond experience, it is suggested, there must be thought, an unknown something, although we are unable to comprehend how such noumena can be possible. More precisely, the noumenon is not indeed in any way positive, and is not a determinate knowledge of anything, but signifies only the thought of something in general, in which I abstract from everything that belongs to the form of sensible intuition. That no transcendent object is found is an event which retains the sense of a lost or absent object, rather than that of a contact with or through objectlessness. The ocean has no sense except as a failure of the land. Even while supposedly knowing nothing of the noumenon, which, we are told, has no assignable meaning, one somehow still knows that it would be something other than objectless waste without end, or the void plane touched upon zero intensity. Kant is peculiarly adamant in this respect. We cannot think of any way in which such intelligible objects might be given. The problematic thought which leaves open a place for them serves only, like an empty space, for the limitation of empirical principles, without itself containing or revealing any other object of knowledge beyond the sphere of those principles. The noumenon is the absence of the subject, and is thus inaccessible in principle to experience. If there is still a so-called noumenal subject in the opening phase of the critical enterprise, it is only because a residue of theological reasoning conceives a stratum of the self which is invulnerable to transition, or synonymous with time as such. This is the real or deep subject, the self or soul, a subject that sloughs off its empirical instantiation without impairment, the immortal subject of mortality. It only remains for Hegel to rigorously identify this subject with death, with the death necessitated by the allergy of Geist to its finitude, to attain a conception of deaths for itself. But this is all still the absence of the subject, even when of is translated into the subjective genitive. And at zero, none of it makes any difference. With Kant, death finds its theoretical formulation and utilitarian frame as a quasi-objectivity correlative to capital, and noumenon is its name. The effective flotation of this term in philosophy coincided with the emergence of a social order built upon a profound rationalization of excess, or rigorous circumscription of voluptuous lethality. Once Enlightenment rationalism begins its dominion, ever fewer corpses are left hanging around in public places with each passing year. Ever fewer skulls are used as paperweights, and ever fewer paupers perish undisturbed on the streets. Even the graveyards are rationalized and tidied up. It is not surprising, therefore, that with Kant, thanatology undergoes the most massive reconstruction in its history. The clerical vultures are purged or marginalized. Death is no longer to be culturally circulated, injecting a transcendent reference into production and ensuring superterrestrial interests their rights. Instead, death is privatized, withdrawn into interiority, to flicker at the edge of the contract as a narcissistic anxiety without public accreditation. Compared to the immortal soul of capital, the death of the individual becomes an empirical triviality, a mere reallocation of stock. In the Analytic of the Sublime, in his third critique, Kant tentatively raises the possibility that we might taste death, even if only through a negative pleasure. But nowhere does he raise the possibility that death might savage us. Even when positivized as noumenon, death remains locked in the chain of connotations that passes through matter, inertia, femininity, and castration, resting in its pacified theistic sense as toothless resource and malleable clay. There is no place, no domain, for base matter in Kant's thinking, since even autogenerativity in nature is conceived as a regulative analogue of rational willing. One must first unleash the noumenon from its determination as problematic object in order to glimpse that between matter and death there is both a certain identity and an intricate relation, or, in other words, a unilateral difference appending matter to the edge of zero. Not that this complicity has anything to do with the inertia crucial to the mathematical idealization of matter, or with any other kind of mechanical sterility. Matter is no more simply dead than it is simply anything else, because simplicity is the operator of the transcendent disjunction between subject and object, which effaces base materiality. The death proper to matter is the jagged edge of its impropriety, its teeth. If death can bite, it is not because it retains some fragment of a potency supposedly proper to the object, but because it remains uncaged by the inhibition objectivity entails. Death alone is utterly on the loose, howling as the dark motor of storms and epidemics. After the ruthless abstraction of all life, the blank savagery of real time remains, for it is the reality of abstraction itself that is time, the desert, death, and desolator of all things. Bataille writes of the ceaseless slippage of everything into nothing. If one wants time and thinks of himself as a tooth of time. It could also be said, in a more Nietzschean vein, that zero becoming has its metaphor in a bird of prey, for which every object is a lamb. Repression always fails, but nowhere is there a more florid example of such failure than the attempt to bury death quietly on the outskirts of the city and get down to business. Only the encrusted historical superficies of zero are trapped in the clay, distilling death down to its ultimate liquidity, and maximizing its powers of infiltration. Marx notes this filtration process in Capital, where he remarks about money, death, that it does not vanish on dropping out of the circuit of the metamorphosis of a given commodity. It is constantly being precipitated into new places in the arena of circulation vacated by other commodities. Dead labor is far harder to control than the live stuff was, which is why the Enlightenment project of interring Gothic superstition was the royal road to the first truly vampiric civilization in which death alone comes to rule.